Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime. So Cameron, I need you to do some reflection before I ask you today's question.
Okay.
I want you to look back on your life, specifically your romantic life. I want you to look back on the romantic life of every person that you know, and I want you to think, what is the strangest thing, the craziest thing, dare I say, that someone has done to get out of a relationship? They weren't willing to just break up and go. They needed to create a scenario that would force them apart.
Well, all I can think about is the podcast that I was listening to most recently, but I think it was like in the 1800s, and this guy was engaged to this woman and he didn't want to be engaged to her anymore. So he wrote her father a letter claiming that she was a slut because he had gotten her to sleep with him.
Wait, what year was this?
Like 1880.
Oh my God, what a dickhead.
And the dad was like, listen up, you're going to marry my daughter. Especially if you're saying that you slept with her. Because what he said was...
Yeah, now you're really fucked.
He said that she needed an abortion, but it seems like she probably never had sex with him. He just was saying that so that he could besmirch her name so that he could end the engagement without destroying his own reputation, because there was another woman that he wanted to marry. And so anyway, the dad was like, come say it to my face, because he wrote it in a letter and he was scared. So he got a gun and then he went to say it to his face. And then he ended up shooting the dad and killing the dad. And it was this whole thing.
That is a lot to get out of a relationship.
Yeah.
So the craziest thing I ever did to exit a relationship or a blossoming relationship is... I told someone that I couldn't be with someone who thought that Fifth Harmony was better than Little Mix. And that was the hill I decided to die on and make the reason I didn't want to see this person anymore. Because it felt mean to say, I just don't want to see you anymore.
I don't know that I have personally done anything to end a budding relationship. I just don't know that I know off the top of my head of anybody doing something weird to end a relationship or extreme.
Let's move on. Let's move on.
Is this you demonstrating how you end relationships?
Let's talk about Portland, Oregon, a city that in the early 1990s kind of balanced itself between urban grit and breathtaking natural beauty. It was kind of a place divided. Interstate 5 cuts straight through Portland, and it kind of separates downtown's corporate hub and the working class neighborhoods. And the Columbia River sliced through that region, also carving deep gorges into the landscape. A place of recreation, and as authorities would come to learn, for something far more sinister. Alifair Burke, a former deputy district attorney of Multnomah County, once described the city's layout. Portland is divided by I-5 and the river. Downtown is the business district, with wealth on the west side and the underclass on the east side. And by the early 1990s, Portland had earned a reputation for being rough around the edges. It was a large city, an urban sprawl that, while beautiful, had its fair share of violent crime. But murder, especially the work of a serial killer, was rare. That's why, when a body was discovered in the Columbia River Gorge in early 1990, the entire city took notice. Steve Dunn...
In what river?
The Columbia River Gorge. So the Columbia River Gorge is actually the name they've given to this like really beautiful and vast natural landscape that's very lush, very foresty, very hilly. It has all kinds of vegetation, and there is a layer of like a tree cover. What is the word for that? Canopy.
Canopy.
I know there's a specific word for it, but I can't think of it. And this gorge was known for being a place for hunting, fishing, hiking, all kinds of sportsman activities.
Very familiar.
But also kind of a place where people would just dump bodies.
I'm sorry, what?
Because it had so much tree coverage, because it was so wooded, because it was so vast, it really lent itself for being kind of an ideal location. If you needed to get rid of a body, the gorge was huge.
If you just casually happened to need to get rid of a body.
Yeah, you've never accidentally murdered somebody?
Not yet.
I have a feeling when you do, it's going to be on purpose.
Well, accidental and murder don't go together.
I guess that would be manslaughter.
Yeah.
Steve Dunn recalls that, and he was a veteran anchor at KATU Portland, that any time a murder happened, especially a string of murders, it was really, really big news in Portland.
But wait, how is this a regular dumping ground, but also big news? It sounds like they've just got a segment at the end of every episode.
I don't think necessarily that the gorge was a regular dumping ground, but there had been bodies placed there in the past. I'm not saying it was a frequency of like 30 plus a year, but it wasn't.
You just likened it to hiking and fishing.
Sorry, maybe a misdirect there unintentionally. I mean, it wasn't the most common activity that occurred at the gorge.
Yeah, no,
but it happened enough to where it was like a known pattern. They wouldn't be surprised to hear there was a dead body left in the gorge.
I'm not actually as dense as I'm playing right now.
Okay. On Monday, January 22nd, 1990, retired Sergeant John Ingram, then working homicide for the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, reported to duty expecting a routine day, the routine start of a routine week.
I mean, don't you go most days to work thinking this is going to be just a regular old day?
Well, I guess for me, when he explains this, because most of this information generally and genuinely, almost all of the information in this case comes from a 2020 special. When John Ingram is explaining what he anticipated for the week, I'm like, dude, you're a homicide detective. Is your week boring? Do you not have new shit coming up all the time? But they really wanted to hammer home that what should have been a routine day, routine week, quickly dissipated about after an hour at work.
Had he finished his coffee and donuts?
Around 9 or 9:30 a.m., the sheriff's department received a call. A body had been found in the Columbia River Gorge. Jamie Floyd, a legal analyst for ABC News, detailed how this discovery unfolded and said that a community college student was taking a drive down this old scenic highway, essentially just trying to blow off some steam, relax a little bit before they started their day, their week. And that as they were driving along, they discover a body. And the scene was actually, again, really dense with vegetation. And all of the roads through the gorge are very twisty and windy, and they go through a lot of steep ravines. And when Ingram arrived to the location that the student had informed them of, he found himself standing at the base of a hill, and he had to actually kind of look upwards to see where the body had been found. So if you're driving along the road, you kind of have this hill going with all of this really kind of dense vegetation, limbs, trees, grass. It's actually really beautiful. It was a very gorgeous area. There just happened to be a dead body at the top of the hill.
You said he was going for a drive, but that he was standing?
So I'm talking about the college student who discovered her going for the drive, relaxing.
Uh-huh.
And then Ingram is the detective who was standing and looking up the hill.
Gotcha.
He had reported to the location.
So this was easily visible from the road if you were driving?
So from the official crime scene photos, it looks like the body was partially placed behind a log. And this, again, it's very dense vegetation. So I don't know if I would say anything was easily visible from the road. But I think if you're driving along and looking, like from my understanding, he saw like maybe the hand and the curve of the body, but he couldn't see the entire body.
Yeah, it sounds similar to the victims in the case that I covered last week, where you could see like their feet sticking out or the arm sticking up that were all left near trash. It
is very similar to that. Detective Ingram quickly realized that it was a female. Her body lay in this kind of ravine with her clothing disturbed in a way that suggested a violent assault. Her top had been pushed up above her chest, and her jeans had been pulled down somewhere between her knees and ankles, and the brutality was evident. She had been beaten and strangled. A rope remained around her neck.
Was she sexually assaulted?
So, from my understanding, she had been sexually assaulted. And there are kind of conflicting reports around this case as a whole, where in some instances it's described as this perpetrator always sexually assaulted victims, and then some make no mention of sexual assault. And so there's this kind of in-between space where, from everything I understand, this victim is definitely sexually assaulted. Sometimes that's always the case. Sometimes that's not always the case. It's kind of a mess in the reporting when it comes to sexual assault. But in this instance, yes.
Sometimes it's always the case.
Yeah, well, okay, here's the
I know
thing.
what you mean, but
they didn't even, nowhere in any of the research did they say that they collected any kind of genetic material or sexual material. And so, but the way her body was positioned, from the looks of everything, it looked like she had been sexually assaulted.
Yeah.
The assumption that she was sexually assaulted.
Well,
but there's no...
What you're saying is that sometimes the sources said that all of these victims were sexually assaulted. But you just said sometimes. It was always. I was like, what?
Yeah, sorry. That was...
But I know what you mean now.
Weird phrasing, but there's this complicated duality in reporting where sometimes it is always and sometimes it's not.
Oh, trust me. I understand.
Obviously, Detective Ingram quickly determined that this was not an accidental death, but a murder. Ingram took in the scene, absorbing every detail. And as investigators combed through the area, searching for anything that might identify her or provide any kind of lead on who had done this. And what they managed to find was a single hair on her body that did not seemingly belong to her. Her jeans also told a strange story. The fly of her jeans had been torn away and it was completely missing. So button, zipper, completely torn off of the jeans, but the jeans remained on. There was no wallet, no identification card, no personal belongings except for two things.
No personal longings?
No personal belongings. They did find a small red Swiss Army knife. Now, it's unclear if that belonged to her, someone else, the murderer, maybe it was just there. There's no real details on that. But there did happen to be a pair of headphones for a Sony Walkman, which was really, really popular at the time. I don't know if you remember the Sony cassette players.
Yes.
Okay. Without a name, the investigation hit an immediate roadblock. Authorities turned to the public, releasing a composite sketch of the woman to local media, hoping someone would recognize her. For more than a week, no one came forward. And I want to tell you right now, do you remember when I told you about the railroad rider killer?
Yes, of course. Do I remember?
Do you remember?
I've been remembering since the 90s.
Do you remember how accurate I thought the sketch was of Angel Resendez?
Here's what I remember. I had a vague recollection of you saying that they were very similar, and then you showed them to me, and I was like, these two things look nothing alike. And I forgot that you said that they looked alike, and I just went in on how different they were. I remember that.
Well, I've got to tell you that this composite sketch that was created looks nothing like the victim who was identified. On January 31st, 1990.
Was she, did they determine how long they believed her body to have been there?
They didn't say an exact time, but I think somewhere between 48 and 72 hours.
So we're not talking, we're talking January in Portland. So we're not really talking about extreme heat or a lot of decomposition, assuming that the temperatures are not in the 70s.
Right.
So why did they do a composite sketch?
Her face was so badly beaten.
Oh, got it. And I'm sure you said that, and I didn't register it.
It's okay. We've talked about a lot of stuff already. On January 31st, 1990, Michelle White sat in her home, unaware that her life was about to change. Her younger sister, 23-year-old Taunja Bennett, hadn't been home in over a week. And this wasn't necessarily unusual. Taunja was independent. She came and went as she pleased, but something felt off. Then a neighbor knocked on Michelle's door. Turn on the news. And that she did. Our news anchor from before, Steve Dunn, was reporting on a Jane Doe found in the Columbia Gorge. The composite sketch filled the screen, and Michelle studied it, hesitant. It didn't really look like Taunja, but then they showed something else. They showed a pair of black boots with leather adornments and ties, and a black shirt embellished with a gold foil and white rose, and Michelle felt her stomach immediately drop. Oh my God, my sister. She didn't need the sketch to know that those were Tanya's things. Authorities confirmed the identification shortly after Michelle White reached out to them. The victim was, in fact, Taunja Bennett. Taunja was described by her family as being warm and friendly and perhaps a little naive. Taunja did have an intellectual disability, but she had managed to build a life for herself. She was social, independent, and her sister Michelle described her as someone who may have been a little slow, but she was the only one from our family who graduated from high school. Where others in the family spent their free time watching television, Taunja would read pretty consistently. She loved books, and she loved Madonna. Michelle White remembers that Taunja loved Madonna and would listen to her all day on repeat. Jim McIntyre, a former senior deputy DA for Multnomah County, noted that Taunja was known to struggle with impulse control related to her intellectual disability, and that lack of impulse control sometimes led Taunja to getting into trouble, to getting into situations that were less than ideal. Investigators knew that their focus needed to be retracing Tanya's last known movements. January 21st, 1990 was the last day anyone had seen Taunja alive, and her sister Michelle recalled that Taunja had planned to visit friends that day, but it was a Sunday, and Michelle felt like she needed to remind her sister the bus only runs once an hour on Sundays. So
Is the bus still running?
No, it's Sunday. It only runs once an hour.
How many people you think actually get and appreciate our random Drag Race nods?
I'm sure at least one.
Sienna.
Michelle wanted to make sure that her sister understood that wherever she went, she would have to be there for at least an hour at a time. She also reminded Taunja to return the movies they had rented on her way out. And I love that kind of piece of history. You need to return the VHS tapes that we borrowed so that we could watch movies. It feels like such a time-distant concept at this point.
It was still a thing when I was in college.
Renting VHS tapes?
Well, you could. It was primarily DVDs at that point, but yeah.
Okay. Can't relate.
I know.
We were already using Netflix when I was in college.
Well, we were using Netflix, but we also still had a Blockbuster. They're not mutually exclusive.
Oh, in my brain they are.
In the very early 2000s, maybe even late 90s, I'm not exactly sure when Netflix was created, we would rent DVDs from Netflix.
Mm-hmm. I remember my mom doing that. When Michelle did leave her home on January 21st, her mother recalls her having a couple of things: the videos that needed to be returned, her purse, and her Sony Walkman. She also had left Madonna behind temporarily because at this time, she was really into a group called Soul to Soul. And at that time, they had a big track called Back to Life. Do you know that song?
No.
All right, never mind.
Maybe if I heard it, but based on what you've given me, no.
Okay.
I'm sorry that's not the answer you wanted, but that's my truth and I will speak it.
That's good. I'm glad. Not far from Tanya's home was a small neighborhood bar, the B&I Tavern.
Jesus.
She was known there as a semi-regular. That night, a waitress recalled seeing Taunja. She was playing pool with two men. Later in the evening, the waitress noticed that Taunja was gone, and so were the two men. Had she left with them? It wasn't clear. She really wasn't able to give authorities more information than that. But for her family, again, this didn't seem like a red flag. Taunja would leave home sometimes for days without checking in, and she was very secretive about her personal life.
Yeah, probably because of slut shaming paired with her lack of impulse control.
When I was watching this episode of 2020, that seemed to be the quiet part, and no one was saying it out loud.
Well, enter me.
The police knew that the next thing they needed to do was to find these two men and talk to them. The detectives also returned to the B&I Tavern a couple of times trying to find more information, but that never produced anything worthwhile. They also fanned out to several other bars across southeast Portland, and one bar in particular stood out, a spot at 92nd and Foster, although this bar goes unnamed, rather just the location. And Taunja was known to...
No ampersands here.
No ampersands. And Taunja was known for going to that bar more frequently than the others, but nothing came of that either. There were no leads, no suspects, and desperate for answers, authorities set up a Crime Stoppers tip line. Someone out there knew something, they just had to come forward.
How old was she? Did you say she was 23?
23.
Okay.
The Crime Stoppers tip line...
And Michelle's her mother.
Michelle's her older sister.
Okay. You said older sister, Michelle, and then you said that Taunja was 23.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided that Michelle was 23 and Taunja was 19.
Okay. That's not quite right, but I understand.
But then I also knew that she was 23.
Yes. And her mother, Hazel, is also discussed in what I just went over with you. But I don't say her name Hazel, I just say her mom.
Okay. That did confuse me a little bit.
That's okay.
Because when you were saying her mom, I was then saying, oh, so Michelle must be her mom.
No, Michelle was her sister.
Tracking.
The Crime Stoppers tip line had been active for a few days, and some calls were made, but they led nowhere. Static, speculation, and whispers that failed to materialize into anything hard and fast. But then one call came in that stood apart from the rest. A woman's voice, tight with fear, reluctance, exhaustion, shared. He's mouthed off a couple times, talking about some dead girl. And I shouldn't be telling all this, but I can't protect him anymore. There was a heaviness in her words. She wasn't just guessing, she knew something. And Sergeant John Ingram, lead investigator, took note. If she was right, this could be the first real break in weeks. By this point, the case had already tested investigators in ways they hadn't expected. Detective Ingram didn't really anticipate the level of chaos that came from this, and the case quickly became pretty disorganized. Between all of the places and locations that investigators searched, reached out to different people, it doesn't seem like these joints were necessarily the places that respected members of society would go or be.
Not the country club.
Right. I wouldn't call it the Dredges or the Fringe, but it was not known for being an overwhelmingly positive atmosphere. So getting information from some of these individuals proved to be really difficult. And in order to keep himself and the case organized, Detective Ingram kept what he referred to as a diary, but it was like this really extensive 800-page docket of information related to Taunja Bennett's case. And in his interview, one of the things that Detective Ingram says is that it was the most jumbled up case I've ever seen in my life. I wish I would have never drawn it, to be honest with you. It was just my turn at the barrel, I guess. I was like, damn.
Did he solve it? Okay. So if we're going to read between the lines, it was outside of his capabilities.
He does solve it.
Okay.
But it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
I'm going to let you decide at the end if you think he solved it. Despite all of this documentation, Detective Ingram was still left with more questions than answers. In particular, the two men who had last been seen playing pool with Taunja was kind of this area that they investigated over and over again. And then finally, somehow, from my understanding, the FBI. So my understanding is that the FBI maybe cleared these two men who were playing pool, but that's unclear. Police also took to canvassing around Taunja's neighborhood, and that ended up fruitless. And detectives were back at square one.
Why was the FBI involved, or was this later?
Listen, I'm not sure. I don't quite understand. I was led to believe that the FBI had cleared them, but it could have just been the regular authorities.
Sure.
Also, they do not disclose the identities of these two men or say anything more about them other than they'd been cleared. But that was their only real lead for a long time.
Because they'd been cleared. And they don't need to be tainted by association with this case, where then armchair detectives, such as myself, might be like, they were responsible.
Yeah, but Cameron, they never even bring them back up at all. There's no kind of
Because they were cleared.
Okay, well, maybe they could have said why they were cleared or something, so I could at least fucking tell you confidently what happened.
You can also agree that they should have been cleared.
Yes, they need my permission.
I think that the biggest plot twist in this case is that Portland investigation does not need your approval. You hadn't even been born yet, child.
I hadn't even been conceived.
Yeah.
They still should have known better. They could have talked to Belinda. I'm sure she would have had opinions. Public pressure started to mount, and authorities really felt like they needed to shake something loose. And in order to do that, they made a strategic move. They released more information to the public in the hopes of generating more tips. And then finally, one came in, a tip that would shift everything. The woman on the line spoke carefully. She wasn't just repeating something she'd heard. She was certain of what she was saying. He said that him and this guy did it. They took her up near Vista. One of them strangled her to death. Then she gave investigators a name. John Sosnovske.
Bless you.
Every time I had to write this fucking name, it would be wrong. And then I'd have to be like, wait, how do you spell Sosnovske? And it's probably just how you think it's spelled, but it's also not.
That actually was the best description. There is no need for you to lay out the letters for me.
Listen, I'm going to. S-O-S.
Exactly. S-O-S.
N-O-V.
No, S-O-S.
S-K-E. Sosnovske. A man, she said, who had bragged about killing a girl. And detectives took immediate action, running a background check. Turns out that John wasn't exactly a stranger to trouble. He worked at a lumberyard during the day, but his seemingly real profession
was collecting zippers off of jeans.
Was drinking. It seems that John dealt with a substance use disorder so severe that it was not unusual for him to black out and lose total nights, sometimes days, related to his alcoholism. And at this time, he was on probation for a DUI. And then there was his personal life. He had a girlfriend, I believe 18 years his senior, named Laverne Pavlinac. And it wasn't necessarily a typical relationship.
Well, I find that surprising.
Who would guess?
That almost 2 decades difference in your age would make your relationship not meet regular societal standards.
I think I talk about it later in my script, but the way these two got together is kind of wild. Laverne was married to her first husband for 26 years. They had at least 2 daughters. Then I think he started putting his pee-pee in another woman. And so Laverne was like, I guess this isn't going to work anymore. And they ended up getting divorced. And then Laverne found a second husband who she was really happy with. And he died from cancer. And John Sosnovske was a farmhand for her second husband. And when he died, Sosnovske kind of just moved on in.
I'm never going to forgive you for saying pee-pee. It's all I heard.
You didn't hear the rest. You stopped at pee-pee.
Farmhand, I heard. But yeah.
Michael Rose, the attorney who would later represent John Sosnovske, had his own assessment of the relationship, saying it was a codependent relationship. I wasn't fully abreast of all the conditions, but I could ascertain it was damaging to both parties. In short, Laverne wanted out badly. And she had a history of trying to remove John from her life. You see, Laverne had...
On the up and up?
Yes, but the lengths that this woman goes to try to remove John Sosnovske from her life. She would call his probation officer multiple times, sometimes multiple times in a day, voicing concerns. She's quoted as saying, he's real paranoid. He does his drinking after about 8 at night. He waits until he knows nobody's going to come around. He's so unpredictable. They actually play a clip of one of the conversations.
Wait. He's so unpredictable that he has a routine of drinking at 8 o'clock every night so that he is less likely to have a PO come by.
Listen, if you get hung up on this detail, we're going to be fucked because it's going to get weirder. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this 2020 episode is they really incorporated a lot of like dialogue, a lot of the actual recordings. And what's so funny is that when she's having this conversation with the probation officer, he goes, uh-huh. And he says it like every 5 words that Laverne says. Laverne continues, and I know he's capable of being violent. Uh-huh. I went through many rages with him through the years. Uh-huh.
Well, you know how when there's a suspected killer and all of a sudden everybody's calling to report their boyfriend or their husband or whatnot, I don't think that they don't hear from disgruntled partners or ex-partners. I think that's probably a pretty frequent occurrence.
That makes sense.
So you might just be like, like, sure, this lady clearly needs to get something off her chest, and maybe some information that is necessary is going to shake loose, but probably not.
You could just tell he was so done with Laverne. Who knows how long they had been on the phone call?
Or what number phone call it was.
Correct. But in this phone call, Laverne also confessed. She was the one who had been making the anonymous tips to the Crime Stoppers hotline. And this wasn't her first time trying to pin a crime on her boyfriend, John Sosnovske. Not long before, there had been a bank robbery in Portland. And when the media released a surveillance photo of the suspect, Laverne immediately called the anonymous tip line. She told the FBI that the man in the photo was John, but it was not. The FBI investigated, and John absolutely could not have been at the bank at the time the robbery occurred.
I'm sorry. Laverne is calling about her husband or her little 18-year younger paramour?
This is her boyfriend, the one that she's been with after her second husband died.
I feel like I missed so much. I thought she was calling about her husband.
No, Laverne Sosnovske is the boyfriend who was the farmhand. And when her second husband died,
I don't think Laverne Sosnovske was a boyfriend.
John Sosnovske?
Yeah. Okay, so John is her boyfriend.
Yes.
And her husband died, but you were saying that he was putting his pee-pee in other women.
That was husband number 1. See, this is when you got real messed up because you stopped listening after pee-pee.
That's not my fault.
Husband number 1 cheated.
You said pee-pee as if you haven't gone in on every single person who I've ever mentioned had any infidelity in their lives. You acted so casual about it, and you called it a pee-pee.
Well, he
and
has
all
wandering
of that was,
dick syndrome.
It was just too much for me to handle. Okay, so she left him.
It's not quite explicit necessarily who left who, but it does seem like her husband's infidelity was to blame. And when they split, she found her second husband, who I think was a good match. We hear very little about him other than he dies of cancer.
Got it.
John Sosnovske was his farmhand.
Right.
And then Sosnovske, 18 years her junior, ends up moving in with her. They move in together. They are boyfriend-girlfriend.
And very suspiciously is probably committing a lot of crimes.
Well, according to Laverne, he's committing every major crime in the Portland area.
Maybe in all of Oregon.
So the FBI had to come in and say, no, Laverne, it was not your boyfriend. He didn't do it.
Wow, they called the FBI in for Laverne.
But now here she was again, this time tying him to a murder. Investigators decided that they should at least hear Laverne out. And I'm going to tell you right now, sometimes I refer to him as Sergeant Ingram, sometimes Detective Ingram. When this was all happening, he was Detective Ingram, but he does eventually become Sergeant Ingram. And so for me, I kind of get it. You'll hear both. They're all Ingram. They're all the same. Investigators decided they needed to hear her out. And Sergeant Ingram, along with his team, went to Laverne's home to meet her in person. Now, just so you know, this was a home that she shared with John Sosnovske, but he was not there at this time. She greeted them at the door, and Sergeant Ingram recounts that he thought of her as being warm and grandmotherly and said that she was cordial, offered us coffee. Just a really nice older lady.
How old is she?
57.
I guess it could be worse. I'm not all that far off in age.
From 57? Or from Sosnovske?
From Sosnovske. And I would probably not be romantically linked at this stage in my life to someone that would be described as grandfatherly.
Okay, but you know what? There are some hot grandpas.
Okay, I maintain.
I mean, who's a hot grandpa? Please send in the pictures of your G-DILFs at endofcrimepod@gmail.com so that Cameron can review the G-DILFs.
These are going to our email inbox.
Laverne had also worked at the state mental hospital before she retired, I think just years previous to this.
Laverne is just so much to unpack.
Well, Detective Ingram felt the same way. He thought this relationship between Sosnovske and Laverne was odd, especially given that he was 18 years younger.
It would be worse if she were in her 30s and he was in his late teens, early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
For everything that I just said, to me, it's not that weird if he's in his 30s and she's in his 50s, if it's out of convenience and maybe necessity on his part, somewhere to live where he also is working.
I mean, at this point, they'd moved into an apartment together, so I'm not really sure what their financial situation was like.
Well, he may have been drinking away a lot of money.
Drank away the farm.
Well, if her husband died and it was his farmhand, if she was not somebody who was going to keep up with a farm, if that was never her vision,
right,
then that doesn't really surprise me. But now Sosnovske's out of a job. So
Laverne started talking, and she told police
sounds like she started talking and never shut up.
She just
sounds familiar.
She just couldn't stop. There was no end in sight. She told police that she had been with John at a place called JB's Lounge, a local bar, and overheard him talking to another man. He said he had killed a girl, had sex with her, and left her dead body in the gorge.
A man he knew?
I don't know. That's not specified, but he was talking with another man while she was present. She went further and said that John had a thing for rope. He would talk about tying me up, playing with rope. The detectives seemed to find it a little unsettling that he maybe had a preoccupation with rope and sexual endeavors with Laverne.
And now we're kink shaming. Oh my God.
And then Laverne decided to tell them what happened the night of Taunja's murder.
What?
I'm telling you, it is so wild. So according to Laverne, John came home between 1 and 2 a.m. that night. He stripped off all of his clothes and he hopped straight in the shower. And Laverne really emphasized this was not something that Sosnovske did. He did not come home and hop in the shower and get clean. And investigators, much like Laverne, found this to be really odd, suspicious. And
yeah, we're really here hanging our hat on everything that this woman is saying, which is a constantly evolving story that's always trying to blame him for things. Maybe he is responsible. Maybe he did kill, but
you know what's funny is that Sergeant Ingram, you're going to love this.
Was Taunja tied up?
No, she just had a rope around her neck.
Oh, okay.
So there is a connection, but not necessarily a connection that makes me go, oh, obviously someone into ropes did this. Sergeant Ingram reflected on this conversation, and he essentially said that because Laverne was such a grandmotherly type, because she was so accommodating, that she seemed really credible. Like she had no reason to lie.
That's madness.
And then on February 16th, 1990, so we're talking less than a month after the murder.
Okay. I think we should pause the recording and we should go find a nursing home nearby. And we're going to walk in there. And what we're going to see is the majority of people who are residing there are grandparently. Yes?
Yes.
So then we sit and we talk with a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
And we take everything that they say at face value because of their grandparently presence.
We are talking about 35 years ago?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm only bringing that up because I think there was a much different kind of deference for people of a certain age in 1990. I think that they were taken more seriously and more respected. So I understand what you're saying. And having worked with the elderly population pretty extensively for a period, I definitely understand the perils of accepting statements at face value from those who are in a nursing home. But by the same token, I can kind of understand where Detective Ingram's mind was. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but I kind of get it.
Also, 57 is not actually that old. At 57, you don't have to look grandmotherly. So it sounds like she probably chose to look grandmotherly. And you see that sometimes in cases with women who will put on this grandmotherly look so that they can earn the trust of people, so that they can scam them and or murder them.
I will say she was kind of like a mix between the author and the character of Sophia. Like, she had short gray kind of curly hair and really thick glasses.
Yeah, they were women who were supposed to be, in their 50s, and they had
Yes.
them looking like they were octogenarians.
Right, which is kind of what Laverne looks like.
But that's kind of what I'm saying.
I know.
It sounds put on.
But I think a lot of women at that time looked like that. I think that's just how you dressed when you hit a certain age. Didn't have to actually be old.
Shots fired. Our listenership is not young.
Back to February 16th, 1990. Police executed a search warrant at Laverne and John's residence. And they were really looking for two key pieces of evidence. They wanted to find Taunja's missing purse, and they were hoping to find the sections of her jeans, the missing fly, that had been torn away. And the authorities looked everywhere.
The phrasing, I didn't like it the first time you said it. And I was like, it makes sense once you found the Swiss Army knife. Nobody tore jeans.
So the way it is described is that the jeans are torn. Now, maybe the murderer started by doing cuts on it and then ripping it. They use the word tear.
Mm-hmm.
But
And you know that I have to make it make sense. So ever since you said that there was a Swiss Army knife found, I was like, they started it with the Swiss Army knife and then maybe they ripped the rest of it off.
Also, I imagine denim in 1990 was so much higher quality than what we're running around with now.
Absolutely it was.
I bet that shit was built Ford tough. I bet it was
like a rock.
Yeah, hard to tear. They searched everywhere. They found nothing, except towards the end, a single scrap of paper became apparent, and on it, in handwriting, were 4 words. T. Bennett, good peace. Sergeant Ingram read it, and he's quoted as saying, "I remember thinking this was the beginning of the end of the search for answers. This was the break they needed. They had John Sosnovske in their sights. They were ready to question him. But what would come next would make this case all the more strange." Laverne Pavlinac had handed her own boyfriend, John Sosnovske, to the police on a silver platter. Nope, I said that wrong. Laverne Pavlinac had handed her own boyfriend, John Sosnovske, to the police on a silver platter. And
how is that not exactly what you just said?
Is it exactly what I just said?
Yes.
And detectives were ready to pursue him. Former senior deputy DA Keith Meisenheimer explained their thinking. The strength of the statements made by Laverne, paired with this piece of paper that said T. Bennett, good peace, was enough to bring Sosnovske in for questioning. And so they did. On that same Friday, February 16th, John Sosnovske was taken to the Wilsonville, Oregon police substation.
Did he do this?
The room was...
No, because did she write that?
Did Laverne Pavlinac write that?
Yes.
I don't think so.
Okay. So he did do something.
Yes.
Okay.
From my understanding. I thought you were asking if he committed the murder.
I kind of was, but...
The room was stark, fluorescent lights, beige walls, and a recording device that clicked on. Detective Corson broke the silence, saying, "Today is Friday, February 16th, 1990. The time is now 6:40 p.m. Mr. John Allen Sosnovske. John, you realize that this conversation is being recorded." And John held on to his calm. He responded politely every time with phrases like, "Yes, I do, sir," or "Yes, sir." And when prompted about this regarding the homicide of Taunja Ann Bennett, he explained that he did understand who they were asking about, and he was very cooperative. Former Senior Deputy DA Jim McIntyre recalled, "He was willing to speak with us and talk with the authorities. He was very cooperative. But being cooperative doesn't mean that he was being honest." When detectives showed him a photograph of Taunja Bennett, John barely looked at it before shaking his head, stating, "I don't know her."
Okay, Mariah.
The interrogation ramped up, and Detective Ingram leaned in, asking had he ever seen this person in his life. Did he ever have a conversation with her? Did he ever have a conversation with an individual at JB's regarding the murder of Taunja Bennett? And did he have any knowledge of the death of Taunja Bennett? All to which he responded no. The story was directly at odds with everything that Laverne had told police. One of them had to be lying. And if it wasn't Sosnovske, then why did Laverne have so much to say? When Sosnovske was given the opportunity to speak freely during this interrogation, which from what I can tell only lasted like 18 minutes, said that, yes, if I may, I'm more than willing to help in any way that I can and clear myself and to help you people because I have nothing to hide. It is alarming when someone is too ready, too excited to say they're going to lend a hand. And investigators felt the same way. They weren't convinced. They collected a hair sample from Sosnovske, hoping to find a match with that singular hair that was found on Taunja Bennett's body. However, the results of this analysis came back as no match, nothing. There was nothing in any of the evidence that could place John at the scene. And this really pissed Laverne off. She was furious. And she began calling these detectives over and over again, asking, why was Sosnovske not in custody? Why weren't they listening to her? Why weren't they doing something about a murder on the loose? It wasn't enough for her to point the finger. She needed the authorities to act. And when they didn't, she escalated further. Over the weekend, Laverne called detectives again with more to say. She claimed that John had admitted something new. He told me he may have written the T. Bennett good peace note. I know. And then she said something that stopped detectives in their tracks. She had found something, a purse in the trunk of her car. And inside that purse was newspaper clippings about Taunja Bennett's murder.
Did Laverne kill her?
And then the most damning piece of evidence yet, a cutaway section of denim, a jean fly, the very piece missing from Tanya's pants. Sergeant Ingram was really stunned by this revelation. And he recounts thinking to himself, this is amazing. It was the break they needed. Because most often, killers don't just kill, they keep things. Serial killers and violent offenders oftentimes take trophies from their victims. We know that the reasons for this: power, control, reliving the crime. And I want to clarify to the listeners that a trophy is taken as a symbol of victory, something that reminds the killer of their domination, whereas a souvenir is more sentimental, a way to remember the experience. And some of the most common items taken are jewelry, clothing, identification, and personal belongings. For some, keeping an object allows them to relive the thrill, and for others, it's a way to maintain a connection to the victim. For police, a trophy, a souvenir, is often the strongest evidence they have. And if this denim fly matched Tanya's jeans, then it was no longer just Laverne's word. It was proof. Detectives returned to John Sosnovske, this time asking him to take a polygraph, to which he agreed. John Sosnovske failed, and the examiner was blunt. He's being deceptive. He knows something about Tanya's death. And when confronted with this, John's story changed, and he ended up writing a 7-page statement to which he read aloud to be recorded. It read, I have seen T. Bennett at JB's truck stop on several occasions. The last time was January 21st, 1990. I was visiting with Chuck Riley, who was playing darts. She left with another guy. They went to a nearby truck stop to have sex with each other. And then...
I'm sorry. With each other?
That's what it read. That's what he says out loud. Or aloud.
Because that wouldn't have been understood. They traveled together as a pair to a truck stop, and then they both had sex with different people. What?
Yeah.
Oh, John.
Later that evening, I saw Chuck Riley and asked him for a ride home. I believe I saw a body in the back of the car. The body was wrapped in a blanket. The body was one of a white female adult. I had not known how she was killed. Suddenly, John Sosnovske went from never knowing Taunja Bennett to seeing her body. But,
well, he saw a body.
Was he telling the truth?
I don't actually think that anybody in this story has yet told the truth, except for maybe
Laverne.
Not Laverne. Laverne, I think, has been the least honest, if I'm being
Laverne's a
honest.
hoot. I bet she could tell a good story. Detectives tracked down Chuck Riley, and he was adamant he had never met Taunja. He never gave John a ride home that night. As a matter of fact, he had no idea why John would even bring him up.
Why would he give John a ride home? He had a dead body in the back of his vehicle.
Well, Chuck was so sure.
It like cosmically cancels out. You murder somebody, but then you give somebody else a ride home.
Karma restored. He let detectives search his vehicle, and the pictures show this car that was kind of filthy, unkempt,
Can relate.
full of junk.
100% sounds familiar to me.
But there was no evidence of a crime.
Exactly.
No remnants of Taunja, no blanket, probably no murder.
Well, there was a murder, but not
done by Chuck Riley.
Not in his car.
At this point, detectives knew that their best chance of really sealing the deal with Sosnovske was to set a trap. They obtained a wiretap warrant on John's apartment, and they had a secret weapon, Laverne.
Oh, such a fucking reliable weapon.
Authorities essentially coached Laverne to try to get John to confess.
Coached Laverne like she needed that.
like
she needed any coaching. She's got this.
The bitch needed help, but not with this. There is audio of this wiretap moment, and Laverne, ever so subtly, says, "I just think about the girl's mother and it makes me sick." To which John responds, "Oh, I dumped the body into the gorge?" Laverne then says, "You carried it." At this point, you hear John a little frustrated, and he says, "Oh, no. Who's trying to put this shit on me? I don't remember going to no gorge, or ain't no body for God's sake. I don't." Then Laverne says, "John, this is the worst thing you've ever gotten yourself into."
How long had they been together at this point?
10 years.
Oh, so he was in his 20s when they got together.
Yes.
And she was in her late 40s.
This seemed inconclusive to authorities. And so,
despite the coaching,
they decided to press forward anyway. At this point, come February 21st, 1990, authorities still think that John Sosnovske is their best suspect for having committed this crime. And all of the evidence that was found in Laverne Pavlinac's car, what was thought to be a major break, came back from the crime lab with the analysis that the purse was not Taunja's. And as a matter of fact, Taunja's own mother went on to confirm that she had never seen that purse in her life. And the linchpin.
Look, the purse was staged, obviously, because it had clippings from newspapers about Taunja's murder in it. Let me guess, because I already know. Different jeans. Those are Levi's, these are Wranglers.
The jeans, they didn't match. The denim fly was not from Taunja's pants. Everything from the purse to the jeans planted.
So what did John do? Because you said he did something.
John wrote down T. Bennett, good piece. He did write that, as in Taunja Bennett was a good piece of ass.
Well, it sounds like you've maybe taken a bit of a leap.
Believe it or not, detectives weren't really happy with Laverne after discovering that she had fabricated evidence. And they found this revelation to be really damning. Her testimony was the reason that John Sosnovske had been put under arrest. And now she'd been caught in the lie. They confronted her, and Laverne didn't hesitate. She admitted everything. She had planted the purse. She had cut a random piece of denim to make it look like Taunja's jeans. She had staged the entire thing. She wanted John out of her life. And although she doesn't say this, she saw this as her opportunity.
You can also just have a difficult conversation.
Why do that?
You don't have to murder somebody if you've been married for however long. I guarantee that the money is not worth it. You don't have to try to get somebody wrongfully convicted for murder if you're done with them. You can just choose to have a difficult conversation.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about.
It's going to be uncomfortable for maybe a week. And then after that, you don't have to live your life concerned about when the police are going to connect you to this body and show up and arrest you.
I do want to say two things. From what I understand, it seems like Laverne was probably in an abusive relationship with Sosnovske. That's not necessarily super confirmed, but it seems to be kind of the prevailing theory. And we do know that abused people at all have a hard time leaving their abuser. So I understand that side of the token, but also this is crazy.
Well, in that case, then you've got a case for self-defense if you just kill him.
There you go.
I said don't kill, but if somebody is physically abusing you and you feel that there's a threat on your life, we got some opportunities available to us now.
There you go. As detectives pressed Laverne about the depth of her deception, she kept talking, and this time her story changed again. According to Laverne, the night Taunja disappeared, she had received a phone call in the middle of the night.
Who had?
Laverne. The phone rang. She picked up. It was John. As she was talking to Detective Corson, Laverne revealed that John had called her to let her know that he was in trouble and that she needed to come fast, and that he had also instructed her to bring something large to wrap something in. And Detective Corson kind of pressed Laverne and said, okay, what did you take with you when you went to see John at the JB Lounge?
Okay, call me crazy, but getting yourself charged with accomplice after the fact in murder is probably just not the most logical way to get out of a relationship.
Well, according to Laverne, that's not what's happening. She's just coming honest with the authorities.
He's calling her to ask her to bring a tarp for a body. There was no tarp at the scene. You don't dump the body and keep the tarp.
Well, she brought along a blue shower curtain to JB's lounge, just like John had asked. And when she pulled into the parking lot, she saw the body. Laverne described the moment that she saw Taunja Bennett's body for the first time. A woman lying motionless on her side, barely visible in the dark. But Laverne said that she recognized Taunja instantly because she had known her. Taunja had been a patient at the state mental hospital where Laverne had worked.
Is that true?
I believe so.
Okay.
She said she walked toward the body, heart racing. And when she turned to John to ask if Taunja were okay or was okay.
Were is fine.
Were okay.
No, it's not right.
Was okay.
I was just messing with you.
I'm so confused.
She asked if Taunja was okay.
Yes.
As it were.
Yes. And John said, no, because I choked her. Laverne claimed that she pleaded with John, we need to take her to the hospital. We need to report this, John. To which he responded, no, I'll go to the pen. I'll go to death row. John forced Laverne to help him. Together, they wrapped Tanya's body in the blue shower curtain.
No, they didn't. He is not going to tell her, no, I'll go to the pen, I'll go to death row, and then play stupid when she's recording him, telling him, this is the worst you've done yet, John. This is the worst situation you've gotten yourself into. What the fuck?
And after wrapping her body, they placed it in the trunk and then drove to the gorge.
I'm so annoyed, in case you couldn't tell. I don't even want to hear this.
Well, you know what? The detectives were also a little annoyed, and they weren't convinced this time. Laverne had fooled them too many times. But if she was telling the truth now...
If she was telling the truth, she wouldn't have a purse full of newspaper clippings.
If she were telling the truth now, there was one way she could prove it. If she would be able to point out the exact location of where Tanya's body had been dumped.
Where they had, okay, and this is how it happened because I also was there. They had rolled the body up in the blue shower curtain. And then when they got to the scene, they each held one end of the shower curtain and they just unrolled it like a red carpet. This is so dumb. So dumb.
The cops felt that if she could tell them exactly where the body had been dumped...
I wasn't there. I was not even a year old.
that it would restore her credibility as a witness. So they put Laverne in a car. And they drove out to the Columbia River Gorge. They passed the place where Taunja had actually been found. And immediately, Laverne corrected them. You've gone too far. And she directed them back. And Laverne led them to a location within 10 feet of the exact location of Tanya's body. Her credibility was restored.
No, it wasn't.
and shortly after, John Sosnovske was arrested for murder. Days later, Laverne approached authorities again, and for what seemed like the millionth time, Laverne said something that changed everything. And this is a quote.
I'm going to go get coffee. Do you want anything? You can just keep going.
Listen, she calls Detective Ingram and says, correction time. And that's what she says. Correction time. That is the literal direct quote. And everything that the police thought they knew was about to fall apart. I know you're so excited for this next part of the saga.
I'm so annoyed. One, Laverne does not actually have knowledge of this crime.
What do you mean? She took them to the exact location.
Oh, the location that was probably reported in the news. The location that was likely revealed during their conversations that the police were having with her. The location that was probably revealed in some other way that they didn't latch onto. Yeah, that's baloney as far as I'm concerned. Laverne doesn't have any information about this crime, which means that Laverne is willing to put the lives of everyone in this area at risk so that she can get out of this relationship with John.
Well, I've got bad news for you.
Yeah, that I'm going to have to hear more of Laverne's shit. Come on.
I'm sorry. Detectives had come to expect inconsistencies from Laverne, but this time she was adamant. And after saying correction time, she let Sergeant John Ingram know that she was ready to tell him what really happened. And Ingram, knowing Laverne's history...
She really got the false evidence in the trunk of her vehicle.
Ingram, knowing Laverne's history of fabrications, proceeded carefully. He asked Laverne if she would be willing to give a taped statement, and Laverne agreed. That same day, she sat down in front of Detective Corson and Detective Ingram and began her story again.
Do you remember when you told me about the probation officer?
Yes.
And he said, uh-huh. uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Yes, I do remember.
I feel that energy in my body right now.
You get it.
Yeah, I get it. I wish that I wasn't the only one seemingly getting it right now.
Detective Corson asked Laverne, when you pulled into the parking lot, what did you see, if anything? And this time, Laverne's story, instead of seeing a young woman lying on the ground, was she saw a young woman standing and talking with John.
I don't even know why I'm engaging with Laverne at this point. I'm so now you brought a shower curtain because we're gonna do a makeshift shower in the middle of the fucking parking lot.
At this point, Laverne says that when she arrived at JP's truck stop, John and Taunja were alive. They were visiting.
John still is.
They were visiting. It seemed very casual, nothing out of the ordinary. And according to Laverne, John had told her they would be giving Taunja a ride home. They all got into the car. And at first, it was very lighthearted. Laverne recalled playful slaps between John and Taunja, a kind of roughhousing. And she actually is directly quoted as saying, she slapped him, he slapped her, punched her, slapped her, and they were laughing. But then the atmosphere changed. She said that the argument became serious. And as they drove down the freeway, the tone shifted completely. John turned to Laverne and said something that made her blood run cold. I'm going to take her. She claimed that John spoke plainly, as if it was already decided. He was going to have sex with Taunja. He then told Laverne that Taunja would not be making it home. Laverne pulled the car into a location called the Vista House, which is a really well-known building. It's a scenic overlook above the Columbia River Gorge. After seeing it so many times in the 2020 episode, I would love to visit it because it is so beautiful. And John got out of the car, went to the trunk, and retrieved a rope. Laverne described what he said. I'm going to tie her up. It's more of a thrill this way. Then she said they moved to the stairwell inside Vista House. And according to Laverne, Taunja laid down on the floor of the stairwell. John then handed Laverne the rope. When Detective Ingram said, what were you doing while he was having sex with Taunja, Laverne explained that she was holding the rope outward. And from my understanding, as Taunja lied on the ground, Laverne had to fix the rope around her throat. And while John was
putting his pee-pee in her.
That's the one. He would
Which she was okay with this boyfriend.
This was all fine.
But the first husband, not okay with.
Correct.
Got it.
And her instruction was to pull on the rope from time to time. And
I guess it was different because she was like a part of it.
Laverne recalled John telling her to pull, then saying, hang on. Hang on. And at first, Taunja was moving. But as Laverne lost focus, Taunja stopped moving. She went limp.
So we are no longer looking at accomplice after the fact. We are now looking at second-degree murder to get out of this relationship.
Yes. Detective Corson was confused and said, Miss Pavlinac, let me ask you a question. Do you believe sitting here today that by pulling that rope tight...
She worked at a state hospital?
A state mental hospital. I know. The irony is not lost on me.
I just questioned that. I just think that she was maybe not working beyond doing arts and crafts, maybe.
Detective Corson continued his question that by pulling that rope tight, you caused the death of Taunja Ann Bennett, to which Laverne responded, yeah, I feel like it's my fault. According to Laverne, she had personally strangled Taunja while John sexually assaulted her. Afterwards,
and Taunja had just laid down to take it.
Yes.
Which might imply consent, but definitely not.
Maybe there was a point where consent was retracted. Afterward, they placed Tanya's body back into the car. As they were driving in the direction of their home, John instructed her to pull over and dumped Tanya's body.
Okay, here's my question. Sorry if this doesn't really lend any credence to Laverne's newest story, but this playful, like, slapping, patting, punching, and then she was strangled to death with the rope. I thought her face was so badly beaten that they couldn't release a picture of her, that they had to do a composite sketch of her. So was that the playful punching, or?
You've got me, sis. I don't know. Not long after confessing to police,
we are not only saying we don't care if there's somebody who's willing to murder, at the very least, young women. We're fine with letting them go, but we are now wasting resources of the police who could actually be investigating and solving this murder.
If that's your feelings, you're not done having them yet. As soon as she confessed to police, Laverne turned to her daughter, Darlene, and she repeated the same story word for word in front of detectives. Darlene, overwhelmed, questioned her, Mom, are you telling the truth? And Laverne's response was strange. I have to tell you, or else they won't believe me. She didn't say because it's true or because I did it, but or else they won't believe me. It was an odd choice of words, but detectives ignored it because at this point, they believed they had their killer.
What the fuck?
Detective Ingram recalls the surreal moment that he placed Laverne under arrest, and she hugged him. And Ingram is quoted as saying, it felt like I was putting my own mother in jail. She was charged with the murder of Taunja Bennett. Everything had been laid out. Her confession was on tape. She had led police to the crime scene. She had admitted it to her daughter.
She had not explained the beating that the woman had taken.
The case was airtight, or so the authorities believe.
I cannot even believe that you would put that phrase in your 56 pages.
Days later, sitting in her jail cell, Laverne started to think. She had time. There were no more reporters, no more detectives. And suddenly her mind changed. She's actually quoted as saying, they slammed the metal door on you. That's when I started to realize what I'd done. Like it woke me up. And Laverne requested to speak.
Yeah, like you're not getting the attention anymore either. Was there something similar that happened in your sinicidal couple case? It's ringing those bells for me.
You know what? There are some parallels in terms of, it seemed, I can't remember what the name of the blonde woman was or the brunette woman, but the blonde woman, it's kind of thought that sometimes that maybe she embellished things.
One of them is Kathy White. The blonde one is Kathy White, I think.
You're right. That maybe she embellished things at times or said things that didn't happen, even though they did commit the murders. Maybe they weren't necessarily as detailed as what Kathy White made them seem. or shared. It does have a similar vibe to that in the way it's being explained. When Laverne's attorney was able to speak with her, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "What would you say if I told you I didn't? That I made all this up? That I lied?" Her attorney recalls his moment of like frozen disbelief. And he explained to her, "I wouldn't believe you and no one else will either. Like, you have set this up. Whether it's true or not, that's what people are going to believe." And Laverne said, "Well, that's what I did. I lied. I made it up." And her attorney was stunned. She had confessed.
I am also stunned because I thought that Laverne's story was really ringing true.
Airtight. Laverne had described the crime in vivid detail. She placed herself at the scene, and now she was saying it was all a lie. Her attorney tried to warn her that she could not take back the things that she said. If you plead not guilty, they're going to convict you anyway. But Laverne made up her mind and said that she had confessed to a murder that she didn't commit. And now she was facing a lifetime behind bars.
That's what I'm saying, Laverne. That's what I'm saying. This is not some TV show. This is not, I want to get out of this relationship so desperately that I'm willing to go to the penitentiary for it, to escape it.
John Sosnovske was also behind bars at this point as well. Both of them were held under the charge of murdering Taunja Bennett. But the truth was still out there. The murder was still walking free because neither Laverne nor John had killed Taunja Bennett. On January 24th, 1991, Laverne Pavlinac stood before the court facing the consequences of her own lies. Her defense was really simple. "I made it all up." She recanted everything from the confession to the details to every accusation she levied against John Sosnovske.
So 2 years and 2 days have gone by since this murder, or since the body was found.
Right.
How many more bodies are there? Because there are more bodies, because that's what happens when you let murderers go free. Okay, Laverne.
They exist, but they're not connected at this point.
I know they're not connected because they are believing that Laverne and John killed Taunja.
She told the court that she had orchestrated this narrative in a desperate attempt to escape her abusive boyfriend. She had spent years living in fear and she wanted John out of her life. And in trying to be free herself, she incriminated herself. While Laverne's attorney did fight relentlessly and pointed out all of the glaring flaws in the prosecution's case, everything from there not being any physical evidence linked to Laverne, the fact that all of her confessions were inconsistent, the fact that the story changed repeatedly, the fact that the denim evidence had been fabricated along with the purse.
Denim fabricated? Really?
He knew that Laverne was innocent, and he argued this point on the final day for like 8 hours.
Who?
Her lawyer.
So he did believe her.
He did.
But he said he wouldn't.
I know, but I guess when you're a lawyer, I think he wanted to like scare her, like, "Bitch, what are you talking about? You made it all up."
Well, and here's the thing, Laverne and any other Lavernes that are listening. In the Lynette White case, he said, "I don't think it happened, but I guess it could have happened," after 307 times of saying, "I didn't do this." There are a lot of cases that go to trial that we hear about in these true crime areas that a killer is saying, "I didn't do it." Or more importantly, wrongfully convicted people give, quote, confessions all the time. And then when they try to say, "I didn't actually do this," nobody in the court is going to buy that. Right. That's how people end up wrongfully convicted. So this is crazy because they didn't even sit her down in an interrogation room and craft the narrative for her. She repeatedly came to them trying to make something stick. She was just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what would stick. And the only thing that really stuck was her saying, "I actually am the one responsible for strangling her to death."
Oh, Laverne.
And he was there when she died and he was sexually assaulting her. And then he was, the rush of it all. He went home and wrote, "T. Bennett, good peace." What?
The attorney makes a lot of the same points you do.
Well,
and
I'll be practicing any day now.
He litigates it expertly, just like you have.
Shh.
And
why do you have to do that?
because I know you hate it. He ends his argument with, listen, Laverne's a lot of things. She's definitely a liar, but she's not a woman who killed somebody. The prosecution's rebuttal was really quite simple. They played hours of her phone calls.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This isn't even 307 times of her saying, no, no, no. This is her being like, yes, and every phone call was more incriminating, and it put her closer to being charged than the previous phone call.
Mm-hmm.
And she is going to be charged, because even once they figure out that she didn't do this, she has muddied up the court systems. Mm-hmm. She wasted the resources of police officers and evidence. I mean, even the stuff that they had to test in the lab to determine not the same genes, all of that was wasted by Laverne's bullshit. I'm sick of Laverne's shit.
The jury listened to Laverne in her own voice over and over, confirming the murder, recounting the crime, giving details only a killer should have known. And they listened, and they deliberated very quickly and had one conclusion: guilty. And then Laverne Pavlinac was sentenced to life in prison for felony murder. John Sosnovske's fate was a different story. While his trial loomed ahead, Laverne's conviction had sent him into a panic. He saw how quickly and how readily they did place Laverne behind bars for life. And in his mind, if he went to trial, he'd be next. John had spent months battling his own uncertainty, his own self-doubt. He knew that he was a blackout drinker. There were entire nights that he couldn't account for. And he began to question, did I actually kill Taunja? Had I done something terrible and forgotten? There are people who posit that Laverne's repeated accusations over time started to convince him that it was something that happened.
Yeah, the crazy thing is, though, sometimes people who get themselves in a situation where they're like, did I actually do that? And they're horrified at the idea of it. Turns out they don't actually have it in them to murder somebody, even when they're blacked out.
Right.
So,
again, like Pineapple Miller, you can only be pushed so many times.
Just the core of who you are, your nature, is going to dictate more about what you are willing to do. Sure, are your inhibitions lowered? Absolutely. But if you're not somebody who sits around thinking about murdering somebody in your just everyday life, you're probably not going to murder somebody when you're blackout drunk, with the exception of getting behind the wheel.
Yes. Detective Ingram started to develop his own reservations and doubt. And the night before John's trial began, Detective Ingram recalls feeling very uneasy. But John didn't fight the charge. Instead, he folded and pled no contest. And the deal was really simple. He would not get the death penalty, but he would serve life in prison, just like Laverne. At this point, Laverne had lied. John had folded, and somewhere out there, the real killer was still free. But no one knew that yet. The courts had their convictions, and the case was closed. And for Portland's law enforcement, it should have been over. But then something happened. Graffiti appeared, hundreds of miles away. Inside the grimy walls of 2 truck stop bathrooms, a message was scrawled. One was found in Livingston, Montana, the other in Umatilla, Oregon, and the words sent a chill down investigators' spines. The message read, January 21, 90, M-, killed Taunja Bennett, M-, in Portland, M-, 2 people got the blame, so I can kill again, M-, cut bottoms off top of jeans, M-, proof.
What is M-?
So when there's a short dash between sets of words, that's an N-. And then if it's a long dash between words, it's an M-.
Okay.
I believe it was Emily Dickinson who used a lot of M dashes. He had these really long dashes between those sets of words. Someone out there was claiming responsibility for Taunja Bennett's murder. Someone who wasn't Laverne Pavlinac, not John Sosnovske, but the message did remain anonymous. One of the DAs in the case against Laverne and John recalls learning of this information, but saying, oh, well, that's hearsay. It doesn't mean anything. It's a non sequitur. It's not enforceable in court. These 2 are still the perpetrators, and we've put them behind bars.
They're not the perpetrators. They are convicted of the crime, though. And I agree. It's somebody just writing shit on a bathroom stall. Is it compelling? Sure. But people write things all the time.
They do. Absolutely.
That doesn't make them true. They've already got their guys. So
I found myself kind of disgusted by the attitude that this former assistant DA portrayed in this moment of the docuseries, because it was so cavalier, as if the investigation and the work they'd done was like infallible, that there's no way they could have made a mistake.
Well, it was obviously Laverne's daughter who went and wrote on the bathroom of this truck stop so that they would let her mom out and reopen the investigation. Is it disgusting? Sure. Yes, absolutely. But you can't fault people who believe that they have gotten it right for not choosing the path of most resistance, because having to vacate convictions or overturn convictions and then reopen an investigation that they're not even a part of, right? The DA doesn't do the investigating. It's the police department that does the investigation. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's baffling to me that we got to this point, because, and I know we're looking in hindsight.
Right.
I understand that. But this is another situation where the forensic evidence and the evidence of the crime does not match the confession or the story or any of the evidence that was presented. And really and truly, they should have decided that she was probably not involved in the case when she had a purse with falsified evidence.
Yeah.
That should have been when they were like, yeah, no, she said she worked at a mental health hospital, but actually
she was a patient.
Yeah.
I hear everything you're saying, and I absolutely agree. And it's frustrating that it just seems like they had so many opportunities to pull back and say, what am I investigating? What is this red herring? And
it's because when you're in it, it's easy to overlook little things if you think that what you're doing is right. It's That's the same true. Reason that the Cardiff 3 were convicted. It's so easy when it is a subjective situation for you. We are looking at this hindsight with the case solved, I'm assuming, because it seems like at some point they are going to figure out that these people are not responsible.
Wouldn't you like to know? This is actually where my case ends.
I know that's not true. You told me we were only on page 20 of 56.
We are on 21 of 56 now.
Right. Once it gets to court, It is almost too late in a situation like this, because everybody has already put up their blinders because they think that they have the right person. Who on earth would go to the lengths to confess their complicity in this if they were not responsible for it? They are not thinking about extenuating circumstances. They are not thinking about this woman may be battered. This little granny who's only 57 years old is maybe trying to escape something else, or maybe has her own mental health stuff going on.
There is a later interview with Laverne where she does refer to herself as being disturbed, especially at this point in her life.
Yeah, because even if John was not physically abusing her, it's got to be very taxing to live with a partner who gets so blackout drunk that it lasts for more than 24 hours. You can understand that her life was probably not the easiest. And maybe he's verbally abusive. Maybe he's emotionally abusive. Maybe he's physically abusive. Maybe he's mentally abusive. I don't know. There are all sorts of abuse out there that it could be, but that's not what the DA is thinking about when they get a confession.
Right.
When they have a confession, they're like, we got this person.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter how guilty they sit there and say that they are not. They also said that they were. It doesn't matter how many times they say they weren't guilty. That one time they said that they were. So when you're in it, it's so hard to see the bigger picture.
Right.
They're not thinking the way that I'm thinking, that a murderer is now walking free with the freedom to kill again.
The vast majority of people involved with this case up to this point have played themselves.
Yeah.
Much like you, or not much like you, but in a similar vein to you, Laverne's daughters, Darlene and Bonnie, were really bereft about their mother's imprisonment, about her being found guilty. And they felt like they were continuously looking for a way to prove her innocence. And in the spring of 1994, Darlene received a phone call from a man named Phil Stanford, a reporter for the Oregonian, and he had a really simple message for her. I believe your mother is innocent. And at this point, Phil Stanford wasn't just guessing, he had a level of proof.
You see, there had been another string of murders that had occurred that had a striking similarity to the murder of Taunja Bennett.
Yes, that's correct.
Was that the next line in your script?
Not quite. I actually, one of the things I really appreciated, and I know I keep mentioning it, but they really just a banging episode of 2020. And they talk about how a man named Doug Bates, who was the crime and justice editor for the Oregonian, he walked the viewers through his process of daily activities, and how one of those was checking mail and, always angry letters with people at the paper, complaints, letters to the editor, things like that. And in April of 1994, he had received a letter that was really concerning, and it was long, pages on pages. And the way he described it was being disturbing, detailed, and what sounds like just diabolical. And in the top margin of this note, drawn in black ink, was a really simple and ubiquitous figure, a smiley face, 2 dots for eyes, a curved grin, and no signature. A confession. The writer admitted to the murdering of Taunja Bennett, but it didn't stop there. There were more confessions. One murder, then another, and another. And the writer described how he had learned over time that his job as a long-haul truck driver made it easy to kill. The writer actually refers to himself as being a transient nomad, and after so many years of watching others get away with similar crimes, he knew that he could do it. And he kind of shared his method, which was drive long distances, pick a place to stop for the night, kill, and disappear by morning. And he really liked that he committed these crimes and got away with them. And in his letter, he expressed that he had no intention of stopping.
Might I interest him in just walking out on your tab?
I love that you said that, because by the end of this, we're going to go over a concept really, really similar. Doug Bates recalled going over the letter and thinking what the fuck? Is this real? Should I recycle this? Do I give it to somebody? What do I do with this? And at that
recycle is oddly specific.
Those were his literal words.
I just love that he's got this confession of murders and with intent to continue murdering. And he's like, oh, do I put it in the blue bin or? This may
be a bit of a paraphrase, but he said, should I recycle it? Pass it off? Ignore it?
Is recycling it and ignoring it not the same? Is ignoring it just lays on your desk and you never really think much of it? Are those two not the same?
I don't know. But Doug Bates handed this letter off to Phil Stanford, and he dove headfirst in to the ocean of information surrounding this letter and Taunja Bennett's murder. And inside this letter was also kind of a cryptic message that read all 5 of 5, to which they determined was essentially a claiming of 5 different murders. And the letter named specific locations where the bodies could be found or had been found: Corbett, Oregon; Blythe, California; Turlock, California; Salem, Oregon; and Santanella, California. 2 of those 5 victims were still unidentified. Stanford immediately called authorities in each of these locations, and bodies had been found at every single one. Sergeant Reichel Dollarhide of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department received a copy of the letter. The murder in Blythe, California stood out. A Jane Doe, a body dumped in a remote location, no suspects, no leads. But the letter writer described details that no one could have known. He knew exactly where her body had been found. He mentioned duct tape, and the investigators had found duct tape at the scene. This wasn't a hoax. Whoever wrote this letter was either a cop with knowledge of the case or the killer. With the letter in hand, Stanford decided to review everything about Taunja Bennett's case. And he quickly realized, and this is his actual direct quote,
that John and Laverne had also killed this Jane Doe.
I was quickly able to discern what level of involvement Sosnovske and Laverne had in the case of Taunja Bennett. None.
No.
They were innocent.
They're convicted.
It was all a lie.
Legally, they are not innocent.
Not in the eyes of the law.
Legally, they are not innocent.
Stanford knew that he had come upon something explosive, but he couldn't just print a serial killer's confession without verification. So Doug Bates, as the editor, triple-checked every piece of information, and the team at the Oregonian ran the evidence over and over. And once they were satisfied, the article was off to the press. And since the killer had no name yet, Phil Stanford himself gave him one, the Happy Face Killer. Despite this article and this letter, the authorities still weren't convinced over in Multnomah County.
Yeah, because now they've got to put their boots back on and get back out there if they believe it.
Old Jim McIntyre, that former senior deputy DA of Multnomah County, wasn't interested in the Happy Face letter. In fact, he was downright dismissive.
Because the case was closed for them if they dismissed the letter.
Again, he's quoted as saying, there was no new information in the letter that would discredit the incarceration of Laverne and Sosnovske. McIntyre believed that everything in the letter had already been widely reported.
Did they check the letter against the M dashes in the stall of the truck stop bathroom?
You know, I didn't hear back on that one. But the one thing that McIntyre was willing to concede was that the writing of the letter and of the article was very good. And the police and DA chose to ignore it. On March 13th, 1995, over a year later, the killings continued. At the Columbia River Gorge, another dead body was found, this time on the other side of the river, in Skamania County, Washington, off of State Route 14, also known as the Evergreen Highway. A motorist had pulled over to relieve himself by the side of the road, and in an attempt to get some much-needed modesty, he walked past the guardrail close to the riverbank. And when he stopped, he saw roughly 20 feet down the embankment a hand, a female hand with fingernail polish. The motorist called in to 911 and informed them of the body. And when detectives arrived, they found the body of a woman, nude, discarded, and faceless in death. Again, no purse, no jacket, no identification. There was duct tape adhesive on her cheeks, and there was a really deep discoloration on her neck and shoulders consistent with strangulation. And investigators began to think this is Taunja Bennett all over again.
Where was this?
It was literally right on the other side of the river in the gorge. So same geographic area, just on the other side of the river in Washington state.
So taunting.
Mm-hmm.
He's taunting investigators.
That's what's widely believed.
Why wouldn't you? It doesn't matter. You could run around naked down the street saying, I did it, I killed Taunja. And they're like, nah, we already got the people who did it.
So Detective Rick Buckner of the Clark County Sheriff's Department received the phone call from his supervisor about this other body that had popped up in the gorge. And while it was on the other side of the river, it obviously was very similar to where Taunja Bennett had been found 5 years earlier. The medical examiner quickly ruled the cause of death as being manual strangulation. There were marks on her skin, again, that dark discoloration, consistent with someone using their hands. Her fingerprints were lifted during the autopsy, and authorities were able to identify her pretty quickly, and her name is Julie Winningham. To those who knew her, Julie was a free spirit. Her best friend Melissa Gavin described her as 5'2", blonde hair, blue eyes, adorable, that she always kept her hair short, that she loved hoop earrings, that she went by the name Jules. And evidently, Julie was the kind of person who had to always be moving. She couldn't stay in one place for a very long time. And that meant she spent a lot of time on the road. Melissa expressed that she had a bit of a falling out with Julie before she died because she felt that Julie had been partying a little too much, that she was a little too transient, and she actually ended up kicking Julie out of her home. Investigators went door to door, showing Julie's pictures to people in the area, giving descriptions of her, and what they really needed to figure out is who had been with Julie before she died. Many of the detectives carried microcassette recorders, And that's what they would use to record witness statements as they went door to door. Luckily, they kind of started to hear the same detail over and over, which is that Julie had been seen 2 days before her body was found, and she was not alone. She was with a singular man, a large man, a truck driver. Detective LeBeau, who was working the case at the time, recalls going and interviewing as part of this canvassing effort. And the woman was able to give some kind of description of the guy, which again was large, an obvious truck driver. And fortunately...
An obvious truck driver?
Okay.
I don't know what that means.
Listen, I don't want to be hateful, but I think there's a specific archetypal image of a long-haul truck driver. And I don't want to say Larry the Cable Guy, but I think that to a degree, that's what people envision. From their canvassing efforts, they also found out that this man, this truck driver, drove a blue semi-truck. Other details that came to be concretized over these several visits was that he was tall. Some referred to him as being well-built, brown-haired, roughly 6'6", and it seemed like most people placed him at about 300 pounds. Julie's friends, the people that she associated with the most, insinuated that this was not a fling, that the man in question was her fiancé, and they were planning to move in together. But nobody knew his name. One friend thought it was Chris, another said Rich, someone else swore that it was Keith. And this confusion made the investigation difficult until they met a woman named Bonnie Vanelstein.
The last names in this case are too much.
When Detective Buckner sat down with Bonnie Vanelstein, she explained that the reason she knew Julie is that Julie would often come in and have coffee at the restaurant that Bonnie worked at. And she shared that she had become such good friends with Julie that she had actually bought a car from her, and that there had been a bill of sale, and it was a handwritten bill of sale. When Detective Buckner asked if that was something they could review, Bonnie very quickly and dutifully agreed, yes, you can absolutely look at the bill of sale. And as Detective Buckner looked over this document, he noted that not only did it have that kind of cursory information at the top about this bill of sale for the car, beneath it, it had Julie Willingham's signature, accompanied with a plain print writing of her name. And below that was a line that read, "Witnessed by." Bonnie confirmed that the man who had signed this, had written his name in plain text, was Julie Willingham's fiancé. And that name read Keith Hunter Jesperson. Now, at the time, this name meant relatively nothing to the detectives other than this lead as a fiancé. Detectives kind of ran into a roadblock instantly, which is that they had no idea where Keith Jesperson was. Julie Winningham was dead. Her body had been found and discarded near the Columbia River Gorge. And her fiancé, the man who signed the bill of sale as a witness, was nowhere to be found. They also noted that for a fiancé, he had never shown up to ask any questions. No questions about Julie, her death, where she was, no phone calls.
He probably prefers to communicate via letter.
Finding Jesperson ended up being a bit of a complicated ordeal. They did not have any kind of home address or known hangout for him, given the fact that he was a long-haul trucker. And so they turned to the trucking industry, and investigators began researching things like truck stops, freight routes, and companies that employed long-haul drivers. And fortunately, they got a hit where someone was able to describe Jesperson's blue rig, and it happened to be the exact same type as a company located in Washington titled TWT Trucking. Detectives moved fast and traveled to Spokane, Washington, where TWT Trucking was based. When they arrived, detectives spoke to the manager. It was a very informal kind of meeting with the manager where they just walked in and started asking questions about Keith Hunter Jesperson. And the manager did confirm that he worked for the company and that he was due in 2 days in Las Cruces, New Mexico for a drop. And detectives knew that this was their best chance to make some kind of positive headway in the case.
This is 95?
Yes. So detectives rushed ahead, flew to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and created a plan to reach Jesperson and take him in for questioning. On March 22nd, 1995, Jesperson would arrive at his scheduled stop, and the authorities would be waiting. Detective Buckner of the Clarks County Sheriff's Department was stationed ready, and as soon as Jesperson pulled in, they identified themselves as law enforcement. Keith Jesperson agreed immediately to come in for questioning. There was no argument, no fight, no hesitation.
Well, yeah, his fiance had been found dead.
And as detectives sat across from Jesperson for the first time, one thing immediately stuck out. Jesperson really, really loved talking about himself. It was remarked that nobody was a bigger fan of Keith Jesperson than Keith Jesperson.
We all know somebody.
But with that, authorities also described him as being very polite, very relaxed, someone who enjoyed receiving attention. During his interview, Jesperson sat across from detectives for 7 hours, and they pressed him about Julie Winningham. Did he know what happened to her? Did he happen to see her before she disappeared? Did he have any involvement in her death? And Jesperson denied everything. He's actually quoted as saying, "I have nothing to do with anyone's death or disappearance, especially Julie's."
Disappearance?
I was like, why are you coming out saying I have nothing to do with anyone's death or disappearance? That's kind of wild, right? Like, why would you say that?
It's giving Queen Gertrude.
With this, Jesperson showed no concern, no emotion, and asked not a single question about his fiance's death. They said that he had a really bizarre reaction. Again, he didn't ask any questions, didn't know or care about knowing when it happened, how it happened, or who did it.
Or if she was dead or just missing.
Detectives at this point were pretty certain that Jesperson was responsible for the death of Julie Winningham. But unfortunately, that feeling wasn't enough to make an arrest. They needed evidence, and they had nothing.
Well, you know what? If they really wanted evidence on this guy, I'm sure Laverne could have told a story that would have put him at the scene.
Laverne could have made some up. She could have gotten a purse, stuffed it with some shit. She could have done anything. So after the 7 hours of interrogation, Jesperson was allowed to walk free, just miles from the Mexican border. Of course, detectives were worried that Jesperson would ride off into Mexico in the sunset.
It's probably a beautiful sunset.
As Jesperson walked away from law enforcement, detectives had no idea what was happening behind the scenes because Keith Jesperson was shitting himself. He was terrified, not outwardly, not in front of police, but inside he seemed to know it was over.
I feel really bad for this guy because
I feel terrible for him.
Yeah, because now he's going to have to be held accountable for all of the crimes that he's committed. And he had the perfect system. All he had to do was travel long distances, pick a place to stay, kill somebody, and then be gone by morning.
The plane ride back from New Mexico for authorities was silent. The detectives just knew they had let a killer walk free. They had sat across from Keith Jesperson for 7 hours, pressing, challenging, and watching his unnerving calmness. As soon as Buckner's plane landed back in Washington, he turned on his phone, and there was a voice message waiting for him. A voice calm, measured, and almost casual in nature. Keith Jesperson had called and left a message, simply stating, "I'll be turning myself in tomorrow morning." For the next 2 days, Buckner and Jesperson played phone tag until finally Buckner was able to get Jesperson back on the line. He immediately asked Keith, "Tell me what happened. Where are you right now?" And Jesperson shared, "I'm at the 4D truck stop, exit 378 off I-10 in Arizona." Buckner made what I think is a pretty bold proclamation, which was, "I believe you killed Julie Winningham." And Jesperson didn't resist. There was no anger or denial or pushback. He started talking, and much like he did before, he just couldn't stop. Jesperson described everything to Buckner in disturbing detail. Around midnight, Julie came in and ate pizza with him. Afterward, they had sex in his truck. Jesperson.
With each other?
Mm-hmm. Jesperson, after they had finished having sex, wanted to do so again. And Julie had the audacity to say no.
So she's asking for it because she's his property.
Yeah, fiancé is French for property. When she refused to have sex with him again, the rejection triggered Jesperson. The rage, the compulsion, the control, and he strangled her.
I hate that we socialize or fail to socialize men to accept being rejected by a woman, because she's not rejecting him. She just didn't want to have sex again. It could be a million different reasons that she could choose to not do that. And that is enough for him to decide that she is valueless.
You know, I understand what you're saying, and I agree 1000%. I think in the case of Keith Jesperson, I don't think it mattered. I think he wanted to kill her. I think there were lots of instances where he just wanted to kill.
Yeah, but he didn't have to go through the pretense of having a relationship with her.
That's true.
Because he didn't with most of his other victims, I'm going to go out on a limb and say. So...
Well, and to your point, I think he does. And again, this is a case of mixed reporting, but it does seem like most of his victims were sexually assaulted.
Right. Well, and like I told you last week, once the link between violence and sexual arousal has been established, it cannot be undone. So there's something to be said about that too. I mean, if he is wanting to have sex with her again, and maybe they engaged in practices that were considered rough, and maybe that behavior for him was escalating and she didn't feel safe necessarily, or she didn't feel like she could handle doing that again so soon after. Those could also be reasons, but because the link had already been connected, if he was already killing and sexually assaulting victims violently, then I think what you're saying is it was a matter of time before he killed her.
Right.
This was not a situation where you're going to find out that, like, how Dennis Rader was living a normal life with a wife and kids and whatever, and then all of a sudden, I don't think that his wife was necessarily at risk, but Julie was always at risk.
Yeah, I think you've said it perfectly. Jesperson went on to explain that at this point, he knew he had a body to get rid of. So he climbed into his big rig, drove back to the Columbia River Gorge, and dumped Julie's body on the other side of the river. And he spoke about it calmly, as if it were just an everyday occurrence. Buckner listened, absorbing every word, and then carefully made his request. Keith, will you stay where you are? I'm sending law enforcement to pick you up. And Jesperson agreed. And when the sheriff's department arrived at the Arizona truck stop, Jesperson went peacefully. One of the things that was so interesting to me is that I'm not for sure which detective it was, but they say during their interview that despite being a murderer, Jesperson was a model citizen. Before turning himself in to Detective Buckner, Jesperson had taken a massive quantity of pills. Now, what kind of pills exactly is not stated, but whatever they were, whatever quantity, it did not work. Later, he would scoff at his attempt. This is a direct quote. "There aren't enough pills in this damn world to kill me."
That's not true.
Jesperson at this point wasn't just worried about going to prison. He had another problem. He had written a letter, one that if discovered would make things immensely worse for him. At this point in time, detectives had not linked him to the happy face killer note, and Jesperson, in this kind of twilight of knowing he had been caught, that he was on police radar and attempting suicide and then turning himself in, wrote and mailed a letter to his brother Brad. And in this letter, he made a full confession. He admitted to everything. In fact, he admitted to 8 murders, 3 more than the happy face killer letter that was at the Oregonian.
And yet still less than I was expecting.
In his letter, he writes, "I've killed 8 women over the past 5 years." Detective Buckner and other members of the Clark County Sheriff's Department make the trip to Arizona to apprehend Jesperson and bring him back to Washington State. And once they return, Buckner actually takes Jesperson into his office, and Jesperson asked to make a phone call. And Detective Buckner essentially says, we're not really in that position, but I will in a moment let you use the phone in my office, but I need to be here with you and I need to listen to what you say. And Jesperson agrees to this, and he calls his brother Brad and gives very explicit instructions to flush the letter that he had sent him. And Brad did as he was told, or at least that's what he wanted Jesperson to think. In all actuality, Brad had taken the phone and held it near the toilet and flushed it for the sound effect so that his brother would believe it was gone. But he kept it. And when Detective Buckner paid Brad a visit, he turned over the letter to police with no qualms.
In a world where your brother sends you a letter confessing to murder, what would you do? Would you flush it like he asked, or would you keep it and turn it over to law enforcement?
For all of my shenanigans and the flippant shit that I say on this podcast, I do have a really strong ethical and moral compass, and I don't think I would be able, unless he held a gun to my head and said, flush that shit now, I would not flush it. But if I were under duress, my bitch ass is doing anything to stay alive. So flush it, burn it, eat it, whatever. And what if your sister did that to you?
I would never be in this situation with my sister. My sister would never send me a letter that she had killed people.
Again, just like fucking Mackenzie Sharilla and her bitch list. Why are you writing it down? I mean, in this instance, I'm glad he did, but my God, foolish. Arrogant.
Because my sister would never kill people. Not just that she wouldn't write it down and mail it to me. She wouldn't get the government involved in it.
So, whereas these detectives initially thought they were dealing with one murder, the murder of Julie Winningham, they now had 8. And things for them became immensely more complicated.
No, they always had 8. Now they knew they had 8.
Right. Poor Detective Buckner, who, for all intents and purposes, has done his job better than anyone else so far. This poor guy, he's like, oh yeah, I got the murderer. He confessed. Done. And then he gets that fucking letter and he's like, oh shit, well, I've got a lot more work to do now. And
I don't know. Once you already have the killer and now you just know that you need to go back and put either names to these victims or confirm and touch base with those jurisdictions, I feel like the thing that would be the most overwhelming is I have a letter that says that somebody killed 8 people, but I don't have the person in custody. I feel like since he's already in custody, it's okay. It's not that overwhelming. It's not like, wow, if I don't catch this guy soon, he's going to kill again.
Right.
It's, well, if for some reason I'm not able to convict him on the murder of Julie, I've got 7 more attempts to get it right and keep him off the street.
Well, you need to take that up with retired Detective Buckner.
I don't.
He's the one that was like, oh shit, now I have all this other stuff going on.
You do have more work, but
right.
It's not so urgent that it's like, we got to get this guy. It's like, now we have to add all of these pieces to this puzzle that we thought was going to be very simple. Like,
who are these people and how do we tie them to this killer with evidence?
Yeah. Well, I think the letter is...
Well, in terms of
and
what's the physical evidence?
You probably have the other letter that has, at least 5 overlapping
Well, speaking
bits.
Of that other letter, Detective Buckner is the one responsible for making the realization that connected the letter to Brad to the Happy Face killer letters. And it's something that Jesperson laments in an interview he did from prison, where he's like, oh yeah, Detective Buckner figured it out. He figured out that it was the same letter,
he didn't
the same handwriting.
When did I become a dad?
I don't know. I'm gonna have to get you some white New Balance tinny shoes.
Oh.
You have to start mowing your yard.
Yeah, I definitely don't do that. I should, but I don't.
Detective Buckner ended up pulling the letters from the Oregonian, reading them, comparing them, and the similarities were undeniable. From the handwriting to the details of the crime to the language, Jesperson was the Happy Face killer. With Jesperson officially behind bars, he developed a fondness for being behind bars.
It turns out he thought he loved a nomadic lifestyle. Innocent.
And he also enjoyed the attention that came along with it. He told anyone who would listen that he was the Happy Face killer. He also
I bet he said it with a happy face.
I think he did. I genuinely think he did. Jesperson also went out of his way to contact the media and set up interviews with them.
Yeah.
His public defense attorney, Tom Phelan, was really unhappy about this. As a matter of fact, he was livid. Phelan talks about how he had been assigned to defend this man who was charged with murder. Then it became
Can you
8.
imagine? Can you imagine being a public defender and having this be the case that you have to take on?
The way he explains how it went from 1 murder charge to 8 is so funny. He's like, what? And then Jesperson wouldn't stop talking to reporters, inmates, anyone willing to listen. He also changed his stories a lot. He contradicted himself, making it impossible for his lawyer to build a strong defense. He talked to the media so much that the judge and prosecutors got pissed off because it had turned the courtroom into a circus. But Jesperson didn't care. He was famous now.
The fact that the defense attorney is concerned about him having inconsistent stories, I think we're fine. I think we've got the same DA probably that prosecuted Laverne. So I think we're okay. It doesn't matter.
One of the things that I found really interesting is that a correspondent for ABC, Juju Chang, interviewed Jesperson and asked how he felt about the killing that he did. And he explained that it was not rage, it wasn't revenge, that it was something else. He's quoted as saying, "You're breaking the law, but you're getting away with it. And so there's a thrill in getting away with it."
Did we need an expert to enlighten us? That's kind of...
I'm not finished.
Okay. I mean, even the person who steals the cookies out of the cookie jar, if they get away with it, there's a thrill there.
Right.
And that's where it all started.
Well, and Jesperson went on in this same interview to talk about how the murdering of these women was like shoplifting. And Juju Chang did not accept that for a second. She said, "No, this is not like shoplifting. You are ending someone's life. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" To which he responds with, "No, it's everything like shoplifting." And he refused to liken it to anything else.
It's not. I mean, not that Juju needs me to back up what they've assessed, but there are 2 reasons that people shoplift. Some do it out of necessity, and some do it because of the risk of doing something and not getting caught.
Right.
It provides a thrill. Is there a similar thrill that he is feeling because he's committing these crimes and not getting caught? Yes, but he's not grabbing a can of Campbell's off the shelf. He's literally putting his hands around somebody's neck. That's one of the longest, if not the longest way to kill somebody. It's intimate. You have to be face to face with them. It sounds like he's doing this mostly with his bare hands. So it's just very personal in a way that stealing, shoplifting is not. It's got interpersonal dynamics that are not present in a shoplifting scenario.
Investigators knew that as this case had now grown, they would need to find a way to connect him to all of the other victims that he mentioned, as well as trying to match forensic evidence and building a case that managed to address all of those things. All the while, and I just feel like I cannot stress this enough, Jesperson began running a fucking media campaign from inside of where he was being held.
Why is he going to trial?
I don't know.
If he's happy to sit there and say, "It's me, hi, I'm the murderer, it's me."
Oh, no. There's an altruistic reason he does it, and I'll tell you what it is in just a minute. But he would call local news stations and give exclusive interviews over the phone. And he started referring to himself as the happy face killer on local and national news.
Right. He's saying, "I'm guilty." So just say "I'm guilty" and let's move on with it.
So much like what you were just questioning about the rationale behind him so proudly proclaiming these things, isn't because he was proud of what he had done. He's quoted as saying, "I needed the press to help get the evidence up front, to show that they had the wrong people in prison." He was deeply worried about Laverne, Pavlinac, and John Sosnovske and their wrongful conviction.
Do you know what I thought? Because I thought about this early on when the first letter happened upon our case. He's writing the letter, not because he's concerned about wrongful convictions. He's concerned that this crime that he committed, that he's so proud of not being caught for, is now being touted as solved. And he wants it to be unsolved because then he got away with it.
Right.
He doesn't want somebody else to be found guilty of it. He wants it to be unsolved.
Correct.
It's all ego.
He doesn't want anyone to get credit for his handiwork.
Right. This is just so stupid.
You know what's so funny is everything you just said was like the next parts of my script.
Sorry.
I said to some extent he was right. Laverne, Pavlinac, and John Sosnovske had been wrongfully convicted, but his motives weren't altruistic. He wanted attention. He wanted credit. He wanted the world to know exactly who he was. A killer who had gotten away with murder for years. The way people talk about this guy that were like involved with him drives me crazy. Because again, his public defender, Tom Phelan, is quoted as saying, "You could have a great conversation with Jesperson. He's very soft-spoken, engages in humor. You could have a good conversation with him, except for the fact that he committed 8 murders." You know, it was this duality that made Jesperson so chilling.
It's also the duality that leaves serial killers, it keeps them from getting caught as soon as they could be because of the duality.
Charming, personable, easygoing.
No, we're giving this guy maybe a little bit extra credit here. No, I don't think so. Because if he was truly capable of a duality, he wouldn't have killed Julie.
Right. Well, Jesperson was asked, how is it that you present this way to the world as being all of these things, but then you commit these heinous crimes? To which he simply responded, it's just a moment in time when situations present themselves and you become what you are.
Okay, party.
Unlike many serial killers, Jesperson didn't hunt his victims. He didn't stalk them. Instead, he did choose women of opportunity. He targeted women that would likely be, or unlikely to be found, unlikely to be identified, unlikely to be missed. His victim list stretched across multiple states. Victim number 2, who remains unidentified, has been given the nickname Claudia. She was found in Blythe, California in August of 1992. Her body was too decomposed to create an accurate sketch, and again remains unidentified. Victim number 3 is Cynthia Lynn Rose Wilcox, found in Turlock, California in September of 1992. She was dumped behind a local cafe. Victim number 4, Lori Ann Pentland, was found in Salem, Oregon in November of 1992. And Jesperson, in his own words, said, "She was a prostitute. I used her services." He claims that after they had finished...
No, you didn't. You didn't pay her. You killed her.
He went on to argue that after they had finished their transactional services, Lori demanded more money, which enraged Jesperson, leading him to strangle her.
No.
Patricia Skypel was victim number 5. She was found in Santanella, California in June of 1993, and she remained unidentified until April of 2022 when some new cutting-edge DNA analysis helped her be identified as a 45-year-old woman from Colton, Oregon. Victim number 6, Suzanne, still remains unidentified, and her body was found in Crestview, Florida in September of 1994. Victim number 7, Angela Sabriz, was found in Gothenburg, Nebraska in January of 1995, and this was easily Jesperson's most gruesome murder. After he strangled Angela, he actually tied her body underneath his truck and dragged her body for miles in an attempt to destroy her identity. And police had not actually found her remains, but Jesperson's confession led them directly to her body. To extend a little bit more on what I said about shoplifting, his actual direct quote was, "It became a nonchalant type thing because I got away with it. It was like shoplifting." And his response to Juju pressing him was, "It is everything like shoplifting. You're breaking the law and you're getting away with it. And so there's the thrill of getting away with it."
No.
I want to circle back to everyone's favorite criminal inserter.
Yeah, Laverne.
Laverne Pavlinac. The common thought is that Jesperson should and could have been caught much earlier. But Laverne Pavlinac derailed the investigation. She inserted herself and John Sosnovske into the case, creating what amounted to nothing more than a wild goose chase for law enforcement.
Almost exactly what I said.
Detectives spent years chasing false leads, wasted time that allowed Jesperson to keep killing. Laverne later admitted how she fooled the police. This is her direct quote.
Fooled?
It was easy. I just read the papers and the search warrant. I got all the details from there. Detective Peterson then pushed back and said,
Do you know after they got Jesperson, I was going to say, okay, so tell me how Laverne knew the location of Taunja's body. Because I knew it was somewhere. I already said this, but they gave her that information.
So they didn't, and that's what we're about to talk about right now. Detective Peterson pushed back and said, tell me, how did you pick the dump site? Laverne recalled the situation in which she was being driven around the area, and her response was, I saw the tracks. I knew it had to be close. I saw where the brush had been moved, where there was openings in the trees. And when we passed it, I said, oh, that's got to be it. Turn around. Literally, not that she had seen anything about official documents. She just opened her eyes as she was riding along and said, oh, look, there's a big opening.
But again, they gave her that information because they were driving in the area. They didn't say, okay, tell us, do we go straight? Do we go right? They led her to it. Turns out she's, for all of her idiocy, not an idiot.
Right. I don't think she would have been able to create so much damage if she were truly an idiot.
No, she wouldn't have looked at tire tracks and been like, that's probably it. They probably came and excavated some body from over here.
In November of 1995, Laverne Pavlinac and John Sosnovske were freed from prison. Laverne's daughters waited for her outside of the prison that day. In a final interview, when Jesperson was asked if he had any regrets, his response was predictable. I'm sorry to the world. I'm sorry I am who I am. If I could go back and change everything, the world would be a better place. But then, he revealed, however, we all know that ain't gonna happen, and I don't feel sorry for the people I hurt. Jesperson remains in prison, serving multiple consecutive life sentences, and for the first time, the world was safe from the happy face killer. Now, that is my story from everything I gathered from 2020's edition of this story.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to take a second to give this kind of honorary mention to the work done by the people over at Evil Lives Here.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish I could have found a way to better incorporate the things I learned from that series, from that episode into this case. But for Evil Lives Here, they interviewed Melissa Moore, one of the daughters of Keith Jesperson. And I just kind of wanted to go over a few details from her story that I think are really interesting. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
So Melissa Moore can actually recount the day she found out that her father was the happy face killer, or at least a murderer. She was 15 at the time, and she had arrived home, and she said that her mother started calling her and her siblings almost immediately, saying that it was time for a family meeting. And Melissa recalls being really, really confused because they were not a family meeting kind of family. That wasn't something they did. And she said that her mother was very somber. And as she and her siblings sat down, her mother kind of just blurted, "Your father is in prison." And her brother asked why, to which she said all her mother could respond with was, "For murder." And Melissa explained at that moment, it was kind of like so many things started to make sense. And she goes on to describe how some of her first experiences of her father was that of when her and her siblings would like roughhouse with dad. They would try to tackle him down. Pretty normal kid stuff, I think. And she said that he would always end up tickling her and tickling way beyond that point of being uncomfortable and in pain. And Melissa said that her father would hold her hands down on the bed and hold her in place, tickling her well past the point of fun. And she remembers that she would cry and say, "Stop, stop, stop, I can't take it." But that oftentimes when this happened, he would press harder, that he seemed to enjoy it. And she also stated that it was a mistake to show fear around her father, and that she stopped showing fear around her father pretty early in her life because he would always find a way to weaponize it. And one of Melissa's biggest fears as a child was heights. And she recalled how her father would take her and her siblings on these hikes And one of his favorite paths had a substantially long bridge, and he would always make Melissa go first. And every time she got about to the halfway point, her father would grab her and dangler her over the edge of the bridge and would just hold her there as she screamed and begged to be put back on the bridge. And she said after that happened a few times, she learned that she had to just run across the bridge. She could not give her dad an opportunity. And she also discussed how when she was a child, she really liked cats. She was a cat girl, but they didn't have any. But because of where they lived, there were stray animals at their home all the time, dogs and cats. And her father liked the dogs, but not the cats. And one day she had found a litter of kittens and she was holding one, petting it. And her father came up and said, "What do you have there?" And took the kitten from her and held it by its tail, swinging it in front of her face back and forth. And Melissa said she knew that her dad was going to do something to the cat. And so she ran inside to get her mom. And when they came back outside, her father had...
We talked about how we weren't going to do animal abuse.
Oh.
And he had done something to the cat.
Yeah, to 3 of them.
Mm.
Melissa also recalled how her father's behavior was always kind of odd, but after her mother served him with divorce papers, it became like much worse. And if he would take his kids out to eat and they had a female waitress, he would do things like ask her for her panties or make blatant sexual comments to her in front of his kids and would just laugh and laugh. And I saved this for last because I think it's the most disturbing aspect. When her father had moved out and gotten his own residence, he had insisted that her and her siblings come stay with him for the summer. And Melissa talks about how his home just had a really weird vibe, that it was really uncomfortable, that she never felt good. And one night she just couldn't sleep because things felt so off. And she had gotten up, gone to the living room, and laid down on the sofa. And as she was staring up, she saw spatter on the ceiling. And she was like, it looked like ketchup, but I had no idea how it could have gotten on the ceiling. And the next day she asked her father about it. And he said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And when he looked, he realized that it was blood spatter. And ultimately he would confess that that was the blood spatter of Taunja Bennett, who was his first victim. He found Taunja Bennett at one of those small taverns, one of those small establishments. And he recalled that Taunja had...
So he lived in the area?
So this all started for me because I was researching Canadian cases.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that they actually lived in Canada, like right across the border.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a lot of his business in the United States.
Right.
And when him and his wife got a divorce, she moved back to Spokane with the kids. And I think he stayed where he was. And so, yeah, in this instance, I don't think because she lived in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. So I don't know if he lived in that area per se. I think that he worked there and drove through there a lot because it was a massive trucking hub. But he remarked that she came up and gave him a hug like they knew each other. And he took her back to his home. So yeah, I guess it was in Portland. And when he got her home, from what I understand, they had sex, but they had a fight and he got mad and he killed her. And he did strangle her as well, obviously, from what we discussed earlier. But I think I told you she had been pretty badly beaten. Mm-hmm. And that blood spatter had gotten onto the ceiling. And after his daughter pointed it out, he was able to go back and clean it off.
And also changed his MO and wasn't beating people like that.
Yeah.
To leave evidence.
And so that's my case. Also, just to add a little bit of more insult to injury, Jesperson's kids, including Melissa, met Julie Willingham. They knew that was their father's fiance. They liked her. Melissa actually really liked Julie because she felt like that was the first woman who had ever been in her dad's life who wouldn't put up with this shit. She said that Julie would tell him, "No, go do it for yourself. I'm not doing it for you."
I feel a little bit misled because I went down a path where I said that he wasn't able to have a duality that afforded him a life being in a long-term committed relationship or even a father. And so I'm thrown by the revelation that he is a divorced father of what sounds like several.
I believe 3.
Okay.
2 daughters and a son, if that's correct, if I remember correctly.
But like D.A. McIntyre, I can concede that it's a well-written case.
Well,
No, it was good. I think that you expected me to be more familiar with this case than I was.
I was almost positive that you were going to have heard it because I've heard of the Happy Face Killer before.
Yeah, I'm sure I've heard of it.
But I didn't remember any of these details.
Yeah, same.
When I was going through this, I was like, wow, this is fucked up.
So also, for all of his wanting to make the media his little BFF thing, it's just not all that noteworthy. He's not original.
No.
He really wants to be. He wants to think that he did something, but he didn't.
I'm forgetting so many things.
Murder 8 women.
Because everything was so memorable as I watched it. But Melissa also shared that she went to go visit her dad in prison after learning of all of his crimes. And her intent was to go and ask him why he had done all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And she said his first words to her were, Missy, my best advice to you is to change your last name. And according to Melissa's version of events, she said that her father then said, but I guess you're here because you want to know why. And although Melissa said that was her original intent.
Again, he really thinks that he is more noteworthy than he is.
Right. And Melissa ended up telling him, no, actually, I don't need to know. I know that you murdered these women, and that's all I need to know.
Yeah, because what she was doing is she said that she was not showing fear in front of her dad, but she was probably in his presence just in a constant state of fear, because I think that the fear of what he would do to her transcended any fear that she was feeling. Like, she was more scared of what he would do to her on that bridge than she was of being on that bridge at some point.
Right.
With her fear of heights.
There is so much more in the Evil Lives Here episode than what I could possibly discuss with you right now, but I would recommend the episode of 2020. I would recommend the episode of Evil Lives Here, and the details for both of those can be found in the show notes from today's episode, just as an FYI.
Jesperson sounds to me like he is a mediocre moron, and Molly agrees.
He is.
He thinks really highly of himself.
Right. He's self-congratulatory.
Yeah, that's mediocrity as far as I'm concerned.
Gratuitous. But you're right. He is mediocre. There are, and I hate to say this because it sounds diminishing of his crimes, but the way he treats himself, the way he thinks of himself, is that he is some kind of elevated form of a serial murderer. And at the end of the day, he was just a long-haul trucker with an opportunity.
Yeah.
He chose victims of opportunity. And so there is nothing gallant or exciting about his crimes. There is nothing that makes him special or some kind of special criminal.
Yeah, he really thinks that he is that, but all he did was he took 8 lives. And he has yet to ever acknowledge the gravity of what he did, because he himself is diminishing it by likening it to shoplifting.
Correct.
So,
and saying that he doesn't have any apologies to make.
Yeah, well, he's a piece of gum on the bottom of a shoe that then stepped in dog shit.
Because today's case covered topics such as suicide and domestic violence, we want to share some resources with you. First, if you're an American listener and you are experiencing suicidal ideation or other mental health crises, you can simply call or text the number 988. If you are experiencing domestic violence in the United States, the official National Domestic Violence Hotline is 800-799-7233. Or you can text the word BEGIN to 88788.
A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review.
Recommend us to a friend.
And make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.